Right, so now we know how to use the muscle properties node. Next, let's look at what these values can control, what settings will lead to what results. So I've just left it with the general settings tab with everything toggled on. But let's start at the top and see what these settings all do. So the tendon radii use world space distance. So when we look at our muscles in the viewport, as I mentioned in the previous video, I had to delete the color, the CD attribute, in order to see the visualization of the tendon masks. And you see here in the general settings, they're black and blue or gold and white, depending on the lighting. But basically, it's showing the tendon mask that is controlled by this tendon mask radius. So if I tweak the radius, it will increase it on the one end and this one on the other end. So if I use the world space distance, if I toggle that on, it's going to have the radius being absolute, whereas when it's off, it scales it relative to the scale of the muscle, so that the smaller muscles have smaller tendon areas for the same radius value, which I think most of the time you probably would want to leave it in the default setting like this. But if you are very set on controlling these as an absolute world space radius value, then you might want that on instead. Next, we have the axial ramp correction, which if I toggle this off, you'll see that the orientation of the muscles is a bit inconsistent, in that for some of them, I'm setting the top end of the muscle, and for others, I'm setting the bottom end of the muscle when I tweak this. Whereas when I turn this on, it is now consistently the top of the muscle for muscles that are oriented upwards, and consistently the screen right of the muscle for muscles that are horizontal. So that's all that this does, but it is useful. So it's on by default, and that is why. I will mention that it's also on by default on the muscle constraint properties. If you uncheck it on the muscle constraint properties, it won't have any effect if it's checked on the muscle properties above it, because this is already setting the axial ramp value. You can actually visualize the axial ramp mask even, and that's what it looks like. So when I turn it off, you see that the orientations of it are random, and when it's on, the orientations are consistent. But yes, so if it already exists, coming in, this won't make no difference. Okay, so those are the top values. We've already gone over how these are going to be how you add extra tabs to override your other tabs for specific muscles. As I mentioned before, the group is where you specify the muscles, preferably by using the muscle ID of the selected muscles. But also, as I mentioned, for your first tab, you don't want to specify anything in this group, only in subsequent tabs. Property labels just for yourself or for other people who are using your setup as a descriptor, but it's not actually doing anything. Enable all is just going to turn off all the parameters in that tab. It's basically like toggling off the tab. So it's better than deleting it just to test it, to see what the effect is of that tab, sorry. Okay, so now we get to the real nitty-gritty ones. Shape stiffness. So this, as you can see when I hover over the name, you get the description from the documentation. When it's on, it sets the stiffness of the muscle's individual tetrahedrons, and it determines how much a muscle wants to stay in its original shape. So that should make you think, oh, if I want my muscle to flex and bulge, for instance, I don't want my shape stiffness to be too high. I would caution against pushing this too high. You might even find that you want to lower it from its default value. So yeah, just bear in mind that the higher this is, the less you will get the muscles flexing, etc. But you will want the muscle to have a certain amount of stiffness, so you don't want it to be 0. So let me revert to defaults. You can see clicking Control and middle mouse button will also do that. The damping ratio. Now here I would say that this slider is very misleading. You are not going to want to ever get near a value of 1 for your damping ratio. If anything, a value of 0.2 is already too high. And it also doesn't really show you how, it doesn't give you a nice range of all the low values you can go. So Control middle mouse click to get to the default. You can basically just divide it by 2 and or 10. So basically factors of 10. So I would just say you can keep lowering it. If that isn't giving you the result you want to add another 0, divide by 10 again. You can go as low as, so this is 10, 100, 1000, 10,000. So about 3 zeros is reasonable for how low you can go. But don't ever go to 0. You don't want it to be 0, but you can go for very low values. You know it's too low if your muscles start jittering, but if your muscles are sort of gloopy, it could be that the damping ratio is too high. So it is a balancing act, but don't let the slider determine what reasonable values are for this. Also, don't let the default value think that you have to be married to this higher value. Your mass density is your mass as a divided by the volume, so that you will have bigger muscles be heavier automatically, but it just sets the mass per point based on the volume of the mesh of the muscle. A higher mass density is going to increase the effect of momentum, for instance. So a muscle that is, it will give you more secondary motion. It will give you more jiggle along with a lower damping ratio, because it will allow points on the muscle to keep moving even after the bones have come to a stop, for instance. Then your fiber strength, this is going to, so all the values in this region here between these two separating lines are only going to go into effect when your muscle is tensed, or flexed, however you want to think of it. And that will typically be set with your muscle flex node, which we will get to in a later video. But this fiber strength, so when the muscle is fully activated, it will determine how strongly the muscle is squeezed. And it's going to squeeze along the direction of the fiber that we set in the fiber groom. So it's going to determine how strongly it contracts. And the damping, the fiber damping in general is going to refer to how quickly or how much energy it loses. So a lower damping value is going to let the corresponding physical property change more quickly from frame to frame or subframe to subframe, whereas a higher damping value is going to give it a more sluggish response. It's going to take a longer time to go from one state to another. If it's something like the fiber damping, which relates to the fiber strength, it means that when the muscle is firing, if the muscle takes 2 frames, I mean, I'm using arbitrary numbers here, but let's say the muscle fires over the course of 3 frames, if your fiber damping is too high, you're not going to actually see that effect. So you'll need a lower fiber damping for that fiber strength to take into effect. Whereas if you want it to be slow in its firing and to lag a bit, you would increase the fiber damping. So yes, again, all damping values, you don't want to ever set to 0, but you can go as low as 1/10,000th. So that is fiber damping. Then the fiber scale range is going to set the value of the muscle tension when it is at rest for the first one, and this is the value of the muscle tension when it is fully tensed. So typically with this range, it means when it's unflexed, there's not going to be any fiber strength, and when it's fully tense, it's going to be 1. But you might want to control separate muscles to always be a little bit tensed. Perhaps you would set this to 0.5, and that means it's always going to be at least half tensed. You can set that on the muscle flex too, but for the muscle flex, you have to set it muscle by muscle, whereas here you could set it for a group of muscles more easily. So that is why it's available in two places. However, I believe on the muscle flex, you can key it, whereas I don't think you can key it on this. I mean, you are able to key it, but I don't think the solver will see those keyed values and update it. Then the fiber volume scale is there to compensate for the fact that the vellum solver doesn't perfectly retain volume in TETs as they compress. So for a little bit of backstory here, there are currently two main ways in which different programs might approach simulating their muscles. The one is called FEM, or finite element method, and this is a slow method, but it's very physically accurate. The other method, which is what vellum is based on, is called XPBD, which stands for Extended Position-Based Dynamics. And the benefit of that is it's faster. The downside is a little bit less physically accurate. So one of the ways in which it is less physically accurate is that it's not as good at maintaining volume as FEM is. So it loses a bit of volume. It doesn't lose all volume. It does maintain some volume in tetrahedra, and that's partly the shape stiffness will help preserve the volume. So that, again, is a bit of a balancing act between wanting enough shape stiffness to preserve volume, but not so much that you can't actually compress it at all. In any case, back to the fiber volume scale, the reason we have this is to compensate for volume loss when it contracts. So by default, it is set to 1, which means there's no compensation, but any value higher than 1 will be compensating for the volume loss. I would recommend against going for too big a number, and by too big a number, I mean higher than about 0.13-ish. And that is because it is scaling the entire muscle, not just the belly of the muscle. And so you can start getting some strange behaviors in the tendon areas. This is a bit of a bug, which I want to fix in future versions. But for now, just be cautious with pushing your fiber volume scale too high. It might give strange behavior. The current best solution, if you're not happy with the amount of compensation you can get for the volume lost or the shape that you're getting, is to use the target shape approach for your flexed muscles. And I will do an advanced video later in the series to explain how to use the target shape. So that's going to be the best way of having control over the shape of the muscle when it contracts. But this is sort of the slightly less sophisticated, but might work in some situations, option. Then the next part, the final settings, are for the tendons. So if you recall from my video a few videos back where I explained that we want to be able to control the settings of the muscles, the muscle belly and the tendons of the muscle independently, because right now, like, this tab method is to be able to control settings for different muscles, but to control settings for different areas of one muscle, we use the tendon mask, and then we can set some of the values to be different for the regions of the tendon mask. So let me turn off the axial ramp display. And I was showing earlier that we can control the tendon mask position with these radius values. And this is really useful to get a quick settings for your tendon mask. And obviously you can refine it for certain muscles where the general settings aren't suited to it. You can go and, do something like this. But it is obviously not always going to give you perfect results, especially for sort of the non-cylindrical muscles. You'll see this isn't quite right. If we look at the trapezius, it's actually, all of this region is a tendon, and it attaches there. So this isn't going to give you full control over where your muscles are, but it does give you a good start for the majority of your muscles. You can tweak it later on, either with a muscle paint node or a procedural methods to set it based on position or something. This isn't the final say you have over the tendon mask radius, but it is the first say, the first quick setup, which is why I recommend against. So this is where I was saying in the previous video, I would suggest not immediately diving in and doing it your way and then trying to fight against this. This is what I meant. So what you do not want to do is to either with a muscle paint or perhaps an attribute paint, you don't want to come in here and try and paint all your tendons first. Well, that was wrong. I was saying it's like this, right? This is really rough, so it's a bit ugly, sorry. But this is what you don't want to do, because now you come in here, you either use this tendon mask radius, you either use this, which will completely override the incoming ones, or you turn it off to let the incoming values through, but now you have to manually paint everything. You don't get any of the free tendon mask that you get with this. So that's why I suggest to have your muscle paint after these. Not just suggest. The standard expected workflow is to have your muscle paint after your muscle properties and muscle constraint properties, so that you can layer it together, so that you can initialize the settings here and then tweak it downstream, right? So that's just an example of how if you too quickly go in and try to do your own thing, you are fighting against what the node is doing. And you might not even realize it. You might create a muscle paint to paint something else here and not realize that you've initialized your tendon mask. And then, anyway, long story short, don't do it. There are some setups available on the internet for Houdini muscle setups, where they have made the mistake of doing this first, and not necessarily in a way that it breaks anything, but it just makes an unnecessary amount of work for the person doing the setup. So don't do it. Put it afterwards. In any case, but this is part of the reason, because it's still set being modified later on, we're not actually setting, when we set the tendon stiffness, we're not setting the same attribute as the shape stiffness, but just a different value in that region. We're actually storing on every point in the muscle, we're storing the shape stiffness. And on every point on the muscle, we're storing the tendon stiffness value. And then only further down in the chain, when it comes to the muscle solver, is it actually going to set that point's shape stiffness value depending on the value of the tendon mask, so that we can tweak the tendon mask, and only later will something like the tendon stiffness be updated. Now, just another thing, speaking of this tendon stiffness, it's very important that this is a multiplier. Okay, this is not that the value is 25, whereas the shape stiffness of the main muscle is 100. This is 25 times 100. So it's, as long as this value is greater than 1, it's always going to ensure that the shape stiffness of the tendons is higher than the shape stiffness of the muscle, which is what you logically want, because you don't want the tendons to be moving as much. You don't want them to be bulging as much and things like that. So we want them to be stiffer. Now, the other thing is that the tendon mass density is also a multiplier. This is also a scale factor on the mass density of the muscles. By default, it's 1, so by default, it's the same. But you might find yourself in a situation where perhaps you have your tendons aren't, perhaps they're a bit spiky, or they're not quite doing what you want them to do. So this doesn't happen in general if you increase the mass overall, but if you increase the mass of one part of a muscle relative to another part of the muscle, it's going to mean that it has more say over what happens. Its higher weight is almost like a priority, in that it will, for instance, it will have less stretching. If you find that your tendons are too stretchy, even with a high tendon stiffness, you can try and increase their mass so that they obey the constraints more strongly, so that the rest of the muscle needs to follow the tendons rather than that the tendons follow the muscle, if that makes sense. Finally, and even though, so these are multipliers, this is a multiplier on that. So tendon stiffness is a multiplier of shape stiffness. Tendon mass density is a multiplier of mass density, even when it's set to absolute here. When it's set to relative, it's still doing it. This will multiply. Well, it doesn't make sense in this case, but if you have it like this, that one relative and this one absolute. So now let's say if you want to double it, so now you're doubling this value, which in turn is multiplied by that. So now instead of the tendon stiffness being 2,500, it will be 5,000. Hope that's clear. Finally, the very last parameter is the thickness threshold. Now, I have not had success getting this to work quite the way it's expected to, so I think there might be a bug or it needs to be reworked a bit, or otherwise it works well on other characters, but not this one. But basically, let me just show you on a specific muscle, say this one, which has a thin area. If I still need to toggle on the mask radius to access it, but if I tweak this, basically the idea is that it will have anything below this thickness, it will have set as a tendon, and anything bigger than that, it will set as a belly muscle. But I found that it's not, it's working for setting this area to be the tendon, but it's not setting this to be fully 0. It seems to be like a non-zero value, so that's why it doesn't quite behave as expected. So I'm not convinced that this is working properly as it should. All right, in the next video, we will look at the muscle constraint property parameters.